Welcome to Reddit Ranger. This is r/DNDStories. Now let's get into it. The tragic story of how a lawful good knight died to save a vampire. Aether Tentragon, for those who are familiar with the legend of King Arthur, you'll know that this name is not but simply the name of King Arthur himself, Arthur Pendragon, with only a couple of words replaced. And I do admit, I did draw much inspiration from the Arthurian legend, but not a simple copy and paste, no. He was nobody but an ordinary person, just your average young man who looks up to knights and aspires to be just like the knights from his storybooks. Those chivalric and loyal, those who put their lives at risk to save those who couldn't defend themselves. And in order to be just like them, he trained himself every single morning in sword fighting and in magecraft. He never shied away from helping anyone, never to turn down a request, never committed any crimes, never break any promises. He was the perfect boy of the village, treating everyone with kindness and compassion. So far as to even become a good friend with the vampire hermit that lives in a small wooden shack located in a forest nearby, who had signed a contract with the villagers to supply him with a bottle of blood every day, and he protects the village in return hundreds of years ago when things were way chaotic. But despite all that, with such immense kindness in him, Aether never passed the test to become a knight in the capital. For the past 3 years, he failed all 3 times, each time so close, yet so far to be on the list. The reason? Well, you see, the world he lives in isn't exactly friendly, which is the reason why it is natural for people to buy their way into becoming a royal knight. And Aether, who was too naive to understand it all, never knew that. Nobody from their village dared to tell him, for they were afraid of breaking his heart. And it continued on over and over for those 3 years until one day, in his dreams, a distant celestial being found him and made a contract with him. It will offer him the ability to become the knight he always wanted to be, but in return, he will be sent to a distant place to help a group of people to save the world. Until then, he will not be able to return. At this point, Aether's mind was already near desperation for hope. After failing thrice in a row and being offered to become a knight, not to mention given the responsibility to save the world, it was a dream come true for him. Without any hesitation, he agreed to it. The being established a link between him and Shadowfell, turning him into a Hexblade warlock, becoming a Knight of Shadows. He wasn't complaining though, after all, it wasn't the appearance that matters, it was the way of life they lead. Now, you may be thinking, if he is such a perfect Gary Stew, what could go wrong for him? But, you see, the campaign he's sent to is none other than the campaign of Curse of Strahd. Minor spoiler of Curse of Strahd ahead. He appeared in front of a party of 3, a half-orc paladin named Gabriel, a human warlock named Ganymede, and a dwarven cleric named Fivium. The party took him in and he joined them on the journey for quite some time, until what happened last session. They're on their way to the church to see Father Donovich to ask him for help, with their cleric left behind at Irina and Ismark's house to protect them in case things happen. They enter the church only to hear moans and calls coming from underneath the church when they do. Curious as to why it is, they asked Father Donovich about it. Apparently, Father Donovich's son, Doru, was bitten by a vampire and has been turned into a vampire spawn. But Father Donovich keeps his son in the basement of the church most of the time to prevent him from being seen. But he was suffering and wished for the party to do something to help him free Doru from the curse. Aether, who literally lives in a village with a vampire protecting it, told Donovich to stop trapping his son in the basement. Even if he is a vampire, that doesn't change who he is. As long as his son has a steady supply of blood every couple of days, he will be just like the person he was, with the only demerit of to be careful to not be exposed under sunlight, which wouldn't be a big problem considering Barovia is constantly foggy and absent of sunlight even in day. Donovich was full of hope. For the first time in all these months since Doru returned as a vampire, he never knew it could be solved this easily. Donovich ended up asking to accompany the party down to the basement so that he could apologize to his son for what he had done for all these months, and the party agreed. They ended up going down to the basement and found Doru sitting there in a corner with tattered clothes, his figure extremely ragged. Aether was going to cut his palm so that Doru could drink up some blood to quench his thirst at first, but Donovich stopped him and went forward to speak with Doru, despite Aether trying his best to stop him. It wasn't until the party's warlock, Ganymede, spoke up and told Aether to let him go, convincing him that if anything happens, they'll be able to stop them. Aether finally agreed, but not before he casted protection against evil and good on Donovich before stepping back. As soon as Donovich approached Doru, he knelt in front of Doru and apologized as tears streamed from his eyes. Doru cried as well, seeing his father showing him kindness. I'm not really sure why there's a question mark right there. Is that... It's just randomly a question mark in the middle of the sentence, right? Doru cried as well, seeing his father showing him kindness like this after all the pain he went through while being trapped underneath the church. It's like a miracle to him, and he hugged his father as they both cried together. The party watches the heartwarming sequence unraveled before them, some of their eyes tearing up in the process. It wasn't until a couple minutes later that the crying ceased, and all that was left was the bridge between a father and son being repaired. Finally, Donovich spoke and asked for Doru to drink from him, and after some moments of hesitation, Doru sank in. And since Donovich wasn't resisting, the protection against evil and good spell wasn't stopping Doru at all. That was when Donovich suddenly said, "It's okay. You don't have to hold in anymore, son." And that one single line caused Doru to snap. Donovich started moaning in pain as Doru sucked more and more from him, and the party members were panicking, with Ganymede ending up eldritch blasting Doru as a result. It sent Doru flying across the room and hitting the wall at the far end. Apparently, the DM rolled a nat 1 for Doru and ended up sending him into a blood rage. That was when the paladin Gabriel charged in to pull Father Donovich, who was left with only 1 HP, out of the battlefield, trying to bring him somewhere safe. But Doru, seeing his father being touched by men he didn't know, lashed at Gabriel. In a moment of panic and trying to protect his friends, Aether hit Doru with his longsword as a result, knocking Doru off of his friend, only to quickly realize what he has done and it was a mistake. But before he could do anything to compensate for this, Ganymede blasted Doru with an eldritch blast, and knocked Doru over to the other side of the room, right beside Donovich. Afraid of Doru drinking that one last sliver of blood left in Father Donovich, Gabriel rushed over and held Doru down, but ended up with Doru biting into his neck in return. Aether quickly tried to persuade Doru to come back to his senses, but I failed my persuasion check, so it all went effortless. Ganymede still doesn't know how to read the room, continued to blast Doru with an eldritch blast. Perhaps it was fate because he narrowly missed Doru's head and blasted the wall behind them instead. That was when Gabriel knew he had to do something, but since he's being bitten by Doru, he couldn't do anything. That was when Doru's exposed neck in front of him inspired him to bite into Doru's neck with all of his might. This caused Doru to let out a piercing scream and let go of Gabriel. Finally seeing an opening, Aether continued his persuasion only to have me roll a nat 1 for him. "Your father wouldn't want this," was what let all hell break loose. And as the second snap goes, Doru lunged for Aether instead. Ganymede, still eldritch blasted and missed. Gabriel was crippled, 1 single HP left, but still shouted for Doru to attack him instead. But it was to no avail, for Doru was too fixated on Aether. As he sank his fangs into Aether, though, the DM rolled the dice of fate. The dice of whether Doru will come back to consciousness through his sacrifice. Nat 1. And as such, Doru went through the point of no return. What's more, it's like fate itself was playing with us too. Because guess what we rolled when we rolled for Doru's damage? 8. The maximum damage in one hit. And it is also the exact number of hit points Aether has. With that, Aether fell to the ground and lost his consciousness. This was when Aether thought to himself, might as well let Doru suck him dry of blood, if that means to not let anyone else die. He's willing to sacrifice his life. But what's more important is, will it really save them? He guessed he wouldn't know, for darkness took over his consciousness, leaving him with nothing but an empty void. What happened after Aether passed out was utter chaos. Ganymede missed his blasts again and again, giving Doru the time to attack Gabriel, and claimed his final hit points. only to finally be finished off by Ganymede with his Eldritch Blast. This time right through his chest, ripping a gaping hole through Doru's heart, putting an end to his berserk and leaving us to roll our saving throws. In the end, Gabriel failed while Aether succeeded. Ganymede patched up Aether and Donovich as best he could with medicine, but wasn't able to carry them out of the basement, for he had only the strength of 8. So he left Aether a note before leaving them behind and returned to the Ismark household alone. Aether woke up. He was surrounded by darkness. The torches had worn off, and it seemed to be in the middle of the night. That was when he noticed small voices of sobbing. Curious as to what had happened, he sat up, and through the darkness he saw a man sitting there, holding a bloodied figure in his grasp, trembling. The man noticed Aether and looked at Aether with eyes filled with furious, burning anger. The crying ceased, and the man gently settled the figure he was holding onto the ground before picking something on the floor up, only to... It just cuts off. That night, a shriek filled with tremendous anger echoed through the night skies of Barovia. It lingered along the silent breeze with the deepest sorrow before settling into the soil along all the helplessness left within. The next morning, Ganymede found that Aether still hadn't returned, and went to the church to investigate, only to find Aether's corpse with his heart penetrated by his very own longsword, tears of regret flowing down his face, and a broken Donovich sitting with his body against the wall, and his neck sliced open with his own hands, holding the handle of Gabriel's rapier, stains of his blood dripping into the mouth of his dead son. And as such, a lawful good knight died trying to save an innocent vampire. Nobody knew what were his last thoughts. Was he wondering to himself what went wrong? Or was he finally questioning that everything he believed in is never anything but a simple dream? Nothing but an imagination that couldn't exist. Nobody would know. That was r/DND Stories. Now remember, not hitting that like and subscribe button would be a critical fail.